Hello everybody, this is podcast episode number 4. It's 6:15 in the morning on Sunday the 5th of May and I'm on the marsh. It's an utterly beautiful morning. Photographers, particularly nature photographers, tend to live their lives in a state of constant anxiety as to wondering what the weather's going to be like, where should I go, what equipment do I take? And I'm no different. I've been living like that for the last 40 years. But it's not the type of anxiety that is going to affect one's health necessarily. It's merely always in the back of your mind as to what the weather's going to do, and particularly at this time of the year. May is my favourite month. The marsh comes alive with the sound of breeding waders, redshank, lapwing, avocet, there's a green woodpecker calling, hawthorns in blossom, albeit at its early stages. And as I'm scanning this panorama that sweeps out before me, so I'm not far from Sittingbourne and not sort of in between Sittingbourne and Sheppey. It's a favourite little spot of mine, so apologies for not divulging the exact location. The grass is covered in dew. I have a hawthorn right next to me and it's just obscuring the sun, but it's coming through as a small starburst effect. I can hear the redshank down by the reed beds and in the pools. It's a height of activity here at this time. There are some rabbits that are just fleeing. I can see a little egret in flight. It's warming up. I was out a little earlier, about 40 minutes or so. I headed out. I'm really fortunate in that I can drive here in under 10 minutes. And after a 50-yard walk, I get this incredible view. The tide is out. There's some rotting barges that are showing well. Crows making a bit of a noise overhead. I know it's terribly early for some to be up and out, but boy is it worth it at this time of the year. You've got autumn and winter to lay in. In May and June particularly, you've got to get out when the opportunity arises. There's no wind at all, and this is what really spurred me on to come out at this time. Noticing on the forecast yesterday evening that the wind was going to be practically non-existent, 2 or 3 miles per hour, and that just spoke to me, of course, meaning that the marsh was going to be covered in dew and mist, and so it was. I'm out again, not with my digital, but with my film camera again. I'm out with a Hasselblad. I've had to get a new light meter, and so I'm testing it to ascertain the light meter to film to develop a EI exposure index. So get my personal exposure index for the 3 combined. The light meter is a handheld light meter that I can assess the scene, and I use the zone system when I'm doing this sort of work. So I'm using my favourite film stock, which is Ilford FP4. I've been playing with Pan F, but it's quite a contrasty film, and Ilford FP4 is more forgiving, and I rather like the display of grain that it gives. So I was keen to get out and run some test shots, half stop increments from what the exposure recommended, and I knew it wasn't going to be giving me a faster speed, so then I just did one at what the exposure recommended, applying the various compensations, and then opening up half a stop and then 1 full stop. I then developed the negatives later on today, and ideally you want to do this test in the darkroom as well, so you're printing and ascertaining what your true blacks and whites is, and grey variants, but I don't have access to a darkroom, so it'd be negatives by inspection. I've been doing this long enough to have a pretty good idea when I look at the negatives as to what I'm after, and ideally what I'm looking at is for my shadows, my deepest shadows, where I want good textural detail to land on zone 3, and that's effectively 2 stops below middle tone. So if I can get that on my negatives, and it's better to have a slightly thicker negative certainly than it is a thinner one, so that your shadows don't go muddy. And this also applies to digital photography as well. So you really want some detail in those shadows. So I was did a couple of shots earlier on using the Hasselblad 50mm lens, one with a deep yellow filter and the other with an orange filter, to really bring out the sky. There's some really nice high wispy clouds at the moment. They're just dissipating, so it's not as interesting as it was 30 or so minutes ago, but looking in the distance there's still plenty of mist visible. The ground is saturated. I'm just walking along a path here beside some scirpus grass. It's a member of the rush family. I said the hawthorn's just coming out in flower. I think, I say just, it's about halfway there, so in another week, 10 days, so we're looking at the middle of May, so everything's on time. I know bluebells are out terribly early, but as far as the marsh is concerned, everything's on schedule. Marsh frogs are all calling late in the evening, and there are, you know, of course, various species of butterflies and moths that are now on the wing, and bees, etc. And it's just a super time of the day to come out, when there's not a soul to be seen, nobody on the roads, or very few people on the roads other than those working on farms predominantly, and of course nobody out walking. There's a great sense of satisfaction when I do things like this time of the day, because I've come out for a couple of hours, I've got a lovely walk in of a couple of miles maybe, with my camera and tripod, and once I'm done I head back and I put on the coffee and have some toast, and all is well. It's a great start to the day. Okay, so now I'm just coming up to a gate. Oh, and I've just inadvertently spooked a pair of shelduck. They're on the wing, and if you can hear these birds flying out, oyster catchers. Shelduck are now flying out across me. There's a rabbit scampering across the salt marsh. There's wren calling in hawthorn. You'll have to excuse these moments of silence. You'll know from listening from previous episodes that there are bound to be these moments, because I don't want to be speaking all the time when there are the sounds of woodland or the marsh. That's far more interesting. I just wish I had really high quality recorded equipment for distant calls, so that I could really bring them to you. But I hope what you're hearing is sufficient. So I'm going to walk my way round to these barges and do some more test pictures. They're an ideal subject for this kind of test, because, I mean, the sun is up, it's very bright, and there'll be some deep shadows because they're a dark green, brown, almost black in some areas. So that would be great for my test to ascertain, as I say, the exposure index for my film meter and development combination. And I look forward to doing that this afternoon, or maybe early this evening. There's still here, of course, a distant hum of traffic on the main road there, but that's par for the course, and part and parcel, as it were, with the North Kent marshes. And there's no getting away from it. The fact that it's very much I can use the phrase, the hand of man, as it were, reclaimed salt marsh and sea walls and industry button up against it. It's just how it is, and it's one of the aspects that I love so much about it. Okay, I'm looking in the distance to pylons and cranes on the dock side, but then just 300-400 metres away. There's relics of the past, barges, sortings where great hulks, prisoner ships, used to be moored up. There's an island, a small salt marsh island, not far from here near Queenborough, called Dead Man's Island, and it's full of skeletons of prisoners that were sort of tossed out of these prisoner ships in the 1800s. Terrible when you think about it, and they're still there, these remnants of the past, steeped in history that the North Kent marshes is. Sailors and smugglers, the shepherds and the residents that lived out in these really hard conditions that they must have endured over the years. You can't imagine, can you? I mean, it gets really cold over here on the marsh, particularly even in summer. I mean, even now excuse me, even now, just breathed in some cold air. It's really quite, I wouldn't say it's cold as such, I can see my breath, but in the winter it could be several degrees colder than on the mainland, so to speak. So you can only imagine how it must have been for those living all those years ago. But I guess they didn't know any different. They were built of, they were tough, sterner stuff, as it were. It must have been really tough. So I'm just going to continue the walk around the seawall. So I've just arrived at these decaying barges. There's the green woodpecker again, and the skylarks up in the sky. It's really warmed up. Now the coldest time of the day is at sunrise, not in the middle of the night, and this really applies to clear sky mornings. But at the moment of sunrise, it often drops by 1 to 2 degrees, markedly colder than it is just, let's say, 10 minutes earlier. But now the sun's right up. Given that sunrise at the moment is 5:30, and it's warming up beautifully, and it's lining up to be a really nice bank holiday Sunday for everybody, at least here in the southeast. I heard a cuckoo as well a moment ago, and I heard my first just day before yesterday. I know in the previous episode I was saying how conspicuous in their absence they were in my local woodlands, but here on the marsh they arrived at least a week ago, and they'll be looking for a host nest in the fullness of time. They'll be looking out for a reed warbler's nest, which they will then lay their eggs in, so they don't do any of the parenting, as it were. They lay their eggs in a host bird's nest like a reed warbler. It'll hatch, of course, the young cuckoo will hatch, and it will push out the young birds of that host species, and the parent reed warbler or dunnock, that's another species that they will often lay their eggs in, will be looked after and cared for by the significantly smaller warbler or dunnock. And that's how it's been going on for goodness knows how long. Remarkable. The natural world never ceases to amaze. I can hear sedge and reed warblers now. The migrants have well and truly arrived, at least a great many of them. I haven't heard corn bunting yet, but no doubt in some parts of the country and even in the southeast they've arrived, but I certainly haven't heard they sound like jangling keys, of course, so it's really easy to identify, but certainly sedge and reed warblers. Sorry, just listening to the sounds. Lots of crows, rooks there in the distance. Just listening again to a cuckoo to the west of where I'm standing. I've come to this spot more times than I can count over the years. Say it's quite close, and if I just want to go somewhere, not necessarily to take any photos, albeit I nearly always take a camera. You have such big skies and wide open spaces here that more often than not it produces potential for a photo. And it's not too far. It keeps me fit having a backpack on and walking. I'm just walking along the sea wall here, but there have been times during storms when I can barely stand and I'm having to walk over the other side of the sea wall, away from the water side, to shield myself from the wind. And actually, the last time that I was here, I got caught in a shower. I say a shower. I was about a mile away from the car, and it absolutely came down. Of course, I left the waterproofs in the car. I got back and I was utterly drenched, but pretty happy nonetheless. I don't mind getting wet, you know. Get home, get into dry clothes, it's fine. Just love being out in the elements. Not a breath of wind. Mirror-like reflections in the pools. Can hear a coot and more hens. Just starting to see some mosquitoes and midges take to the air now that it's warming up. Okay, so as I said, I've arrived at these decaying, rotting hulls, barges that are strewn across here, and I've taken innumerable photographs of these over the years. The most atmospheric being when there's a nice thick fog laying across. It really evokes that sort of timeless quality to the scene. Lots of hard shadows. I failed to mention why I was getting this exposure index. It's because of the film speed, or your ISO as it's known as. Very rarely when you're shooting film do you rate the camera's ISO at what the film recommends. We call it box speed. So Ilford FP4, for example, is ISO 125, 125. But you often rate it, maybe more, maybe less, depends on your camera's meter. It might tend to over or underexpose. The developer which you use, whether you send it away, and this is always worth doing. If you're a film photographer and you send your film away, ask them what film it is that they use, then look up the characteristics of that film, because there are certain types of developers, such as D76 for example, is one such film which requires a speed increase excuse me, or rather an increase in exposure. I find it's about 2/3 of a stop less than another developer like Xtol, for example, or FX55, or the one which I use at the moment, which is HC110, which is a box speed developer. So it retains the speed of the box speed, but then that all then depends on the camera's light meter. And that's what I'm doing at the moment. So I'm taking varying exposures. To arrive at the correct exposure index with the light meter, developer and film combination. And I have a feeling, given how I just sort of compared this light meter to the previous one I had, that it's about 2/3 of a stop off from what I had originally. So I'm just here to confirm that, and if that's the case, I'll rate 125, 2/3 of a stop less, which would be ISO 80. And that will give me my personal exposure index. It's a personal exposure index because this won't apply to everybody using that film with that developer, because it all depends on how your light meter reads the scene. It's purely my own my own exposure index. So as I say, if you're a film worker, it's worth getting in touch with the laboratory that you send your work to, ask them what developer they use, and then find out the characteristics of that film, then run your own tests. But keep using the same lab. Don't chop and change, because if you do, they'll all be using different developers. You end up with different results. Ideally, and particularly with film photography, and more so with black and white, I think, than colour, you want consistency, so that when you take an exposure reading and you want detail in the highlights and detail in the shadows, that you're not having to bracket, you're not speculating. And there might be times, of course, when you have to send it to an alternative laboratory. And this is why ideally you develop at home. You develop your films at home so that you can run a consistent process. It's very frustrating if, for example, a film goes out of commission, or there are importing issues, etc. And so, but what is so good about a developer like Kodak's HC110 is that you can buy a litre, and it requires very little for each film, and it lasts an absolute age. It will last for years and years, as opposed to other developers which, as soon as you undo the bottle and it starts to oxidise, it'll last maybe just a few months. So given the development of film for me personally is quite sporadic, I use HC110, but Rodinal is another example that will last for decades, frankly. But Rodinal's not particularly good for a fast film like Ilford HP5 400 ISO. It's gives quite a grainy result. Very, very good for slow films, but this is why HC110 is a more all-round developer. Much like D76, good for slow films as well as fast. But I prefer the box speed capabilities of HC110 as opposed to D76, which tends to slow the film down. I think I'm going to set up the camera now and run a few tests on the scene in front of me. There's a nice raking light, and that's important for this kind of test. If I leave it another hour, because I'm tempted to walk on to the far end, then the sun will be much higher and there'll be less shadow areas to work with. So I'm going to pause this and set the camera up, most likely with a 50mm lens on the Hasselblad, so that's an equivalent to a 28mm on a full frame camera. No filters, because I don't want to add anything onto the lens that will complicate the exposure. I'm purely just going to run tests here. As I'm looking at the front of this barge, half is in deep shadow, the other half in bright sunlight, and the green algae on there is going to act as a superb middle tone to take a reading from with my spot meter. So compositionally, we're not looking at anything earth-shattering here by any stretch of the imagination, purely for purposes of obtaining my my personal box speed for the combination which I've mentioned. So I'm going to set everything up. I won't be able to record when I'm getting down there, because it's particularly muddy and I've got to navigate a rather rocky sea wall to get down, so I'll need all hands and concentration so I don't end up planted face first in the mud. That would be very unceremonious. So I'm going to put you on hold and I'll come back to you soon. I'll just run through the setup here. I've just finished taking three photos. I can't help but stop intermittently and listen to the bird call. I really must concentrate. So I've chosen an angle that's not particularly interesting compositionally, but it's important in that pretty much half the scene is in bright sunlight and the other is in deep shadow, particularly where there's seaweed dragging onto the shore, which is really dark. I'm using the Hasselblad film camera here, so it's the 501 cm with the Ilford FP4, which is ISO 125. So I'm trying to ascertain my personal speed of the film with the developer and with the light meter that I'm using. Really important that I get this so that I have consistent results with this combination in the future. I don't have a densitometer, which is what Ansel Adams used to use to get his personal exposure index, nor do I have access, nor do I have a home darkroom. I have to rent one, and I don't know when I'm next going to have the time to go there and do that. So I'm going to go for negatives by inspection, which is fairly straightforward here. So anyway, I'll set the photo up, took an exposure reading from the shadows and then from the sky, so from the shadows and then from the highlights. Now it's really important that I expose for the shadows here, since that is really the most important part when you are composing and exposing for the photograph, is getting detail in the shadows, at least for the most part. Of course not with all photos, but at least for the most part. That's really what I want to get a handle on here, is where I need to, how I need to rate the film to place the shadows 2 stops below middle tone, because as we know, all cameras and all meters read, whether it be a bright area or a dark area, as a middle tone, as 18% grey, as a middle tone. Now if I take a reading from the shadows and leave it at that, then that will place that on zone 5 or middle grey, which is overexposing that area, which in turn will then grossly overexpose the brighter portions of the scene. So you have to underexpose. This is no different with digital photography. If you leave it on manually, if you have it on manual exposure, aperture priority in your photograph in the snow, for example, if you leave the camera at what the meter recommends, your snow will come out a dirty grey. You have to deliberately overexpose, force the camera to overexpose by as much as, well, depending on whether it's cloudy or bright, reflecting off the snow by between 2 and 3 stops. And so I'm doing just the same here, but the opposite applies. So I'm taking a reading from the shadows, but to make it a deep shadow, I'm placing it 2 stops down from what the meter is recommending, effectively putting it on zone 3. So with that, by placing that on zone 3 and noticing that the highlights are then falling on zone 9.5, which is effectively 1.5 stops brighter than what the film can handle. Zone 8 is where you'll get good textural detail, so that's 3 stops above mid-tone. And you're more than that, and well, of course it depends on the film and the developer combination, but more often than not you're going to start ending up with a bleached out area, lacking any real detail. So I placed a 2-stop graduated filter over this, which effectively toned it down from appearing from zone 9.5 to zone 7.5, so only 2.5 stops above mid-tone, which was perfect really. So it's now placed the sky in zone 7.5. The shadows I placed on zone 3. So I did one picture at that, which ended up at being 1/4 of a second at f16. And then another at between 11 and 16, so I've overexposed by 1/2 stop, and then one more at 1/2 a second at f16, so, and that's 1 full stop. So I didn't want to compromise on depth of field here, so I just put it back to the original exposure, which would have been 1/4 of a second at f16, but then open it up to 1/2 a second at f16. So I'll have 3 pictures, one where I've done it at what my meter recommends, 2 stops down from shadows, another 1/2 a stop over, and another 1 stop over. You might be thinking, why haven't I closed it down and done some which are underexposed? Because it's very, very rare that you're ever having to increase the box speed of the film. Very rare indeed. In fact, I've never personally come across a situation in my own experience where I've had to do that. It's nearly always having to overexpose somewhat. So I really just want to ascertain whether or not I overexpose by 1/2 a stop or 1 stop with the meter that I'm reading the scene from, and with the developer combination that I'm using. So once I'm home and I've developed the negatives, I'll be able to see whether or not I can shoot at what the meter recommends, or I need to rate it at, let's say, 64 or 50 or 80. But I'm working in 1/2 stop increments here. Hasselblad lenses have 1/2 stop click increments here, so I'll be working on 1/2 stop increments. Of course I can set it to 1/3 of a stop, but it's very tricky on here, so I'll be working for 1/2 a stop or thereabouts. So you know, 1/4 of a stop here or there is not going to make any difference whatsoever. So the film will be rated according to how shadows look on the negatives. So all being well, I should find out the results later on this afternoon. Okay, so I'm going to pack the equipment away, carry on with my walk. No intention really to take any more photos. The sky is blue. There are some obvious airplane trails now in the sky, devoid of any at all. First thing in the morning at 5:30, it was lovely. The sky had some beautiful wispy wispy clouds that I managed to photograph reflected in the pond, in the ponds that I was photographing earlier on the marsh. But now those interesting clouds have all but disappeared, and the sky is full of, sadly, vapour trails, aircraft flying overhead. But it's a beautiful warm morning, so I'm just going to continue my walk now, pack the gear away, continue my walk, and see what else I can hear and see, of course. Bye for now. So I've just taken another composition for the tests, this time of the sweeping sea wall leading toward the barges. The sky is still clearish, few wispy clouds, bright sunlight. It's now 7:30, thereabouts, so the sun is 2 hours after sunrise. The dew still lays heavy, and the reed and sedge warblers continue to sing and flitter from reed stem to reed stem. It's as I say, it's just full of activity, the marsh at the moment. And of course you've got gulls there in the distance, and I can hear some of the industry along with viewing the cattle as well as they're grazing across the marsh. It's a lovely sight. So yeah, the composition consists of the sweeping sea wall on the shadow and on the shoreline side in deep shadow. So I went down to the rocks, took a reading from those, and then of the sky. The difference between the two areas, once I'd placed the rocks in shadow at zone 3, so that's 2 stops down, was that the sky was still going to be on about zone 9.5 or thereabouts, almost zone 10, which would have placed it beyond the film's latitude. So I placed a 2-stop hard edge graduated filter this time because I had a definite horizon to work with. So I put on the 2-stop hard edge, which then placed the highlights just approximately 3 stops beyond, which makes it more than manageable. In fact, I could have left it even just with a 1-stop grad, because FP4 and Ilford HP5 are very forgiving films, unlike the T-grain emulsions, which tend to be much more contrasting, and including Pan F actually come to that. But in any case, I didn't want to take any chances. This isn't necessarily a composition that I'm going to keep or print or scan, really just for the purposes of the test, but nonetheless it's still part of the process, as it were. And so yeah, by placing the rocks on zone 3 and with the graduated filter, they're all fitted within the latitude, as it were, within the latitude of that film. So I took one photo with what the meter recommended, and then another one full stop over. Now I only had two exposures left on that roll of film, so I couldn't do them in half-stop increments, so I just did one full stop. That will tell me what I need to know. If there's not sufficient detail in the shadows, I know that plus 1 stop or rating the film at about 50 or 64 ISO is the way to go in the future. But I'll know more once I develop the negatives, either later this afternoon or tomorrow. We'll just see how time goes. So I won't say goodbye now, because I'd like to continue this while I'm reviewing the negatives. I think it'll be quite interesting for you to hear the results. So I just wish you all a very pleasant day. Of course the podcast won't be out until I've got the results, so whether that be this evening or tomorrow, I know not, but most likely some point over the bank holiday. And so until then, enjoy your day, and I'll speak again soon. Bye for now. It's 6:30 in the morning. I'm on the Kent marshes. It's a beautiful morning. I arrived at 5 o'clock, so dawn was just breaking. And now, as I'm looking out from the vehicle, there are lapwing displaying, a skylark's just flown past, coot just 20 or 30 yards or so away. And I've been photographing redshank as they've been coming and going, protecting their young, and marsh harriers. It's a wonderful time of the year. I mean, any time on the marshes is a good time, but particularly in spring, when there's so much activity. You can hear some grey-lag geese. and perhaps a distant croak of marsh frogs too. So going on from what I was saying previously about discovering the exposure index, or rather the box speed of the film that I'm using, Ilford FP4, with my chosen developer Kodak HC110 and the new light meter, and the negatives came out a little heavy, which to me suggests that I need to reduce development, which I'm going to do so by about 20%. So the exposure looked okay, but if the negatives look kind of dense, as it were, too contrasting, then I need to reduce development. So I'll do that. I'll do another test, and I'm pretty sure then that'll be okay. So as it turns out, the correct exposure for that film will be with ISO 125, so the meter is absolutely good, and Kodak HC110 gives me box speed, so that's good. It means I don't have to slow the film down any further or speed it up. I just need to reduce development. So to be sure of that, belt and braces, I'll be doing another test soon enough, where I'll be reducing development by 20%, and that will just soften the contrast, as it were, and give me greater dynamic range, as it were, particularly in the highlights. You don't want those blowing out. So I'll be doing that before too long. But in the meantime, I'm just enjoying this morning. As I say, I'm on the marshes. The sun has been up for just over an hour, and it's just reappearing again. It was visible right up until maybe 30-40 minutes post sunrise, and then it hid behind a cloud and it's just becoming visible again. I'm looking into the sun. You can hear distant redshanks, and as they're flying, their wings are backlit. It looks really good. I've got my Nikon Z8 with me with a 400mm. Occasionally I've been using it with the 1.4 converter, but when the light's a little bit low, it's no good, frankly, because that converter then makes it into a 6.3 and makes it very tough for lenses to focus. But as soon as I take the converter off and it goes back to the 4.5 native aperture, then it focuses no problem at all on fast flying subjects. And I'm shooting at a shutter speed of about 2.5 thousandths of a second at 4.5, which is giving me about 6400 ISO. Okay, just had a pipit fly past. I'm going to stay here just for a little bit longer before I head back. Got to make the most of mornings like this when it's absolutely dead calm. There's a really nice chill in the air, dew-soaked grass, sun, as I say, is just reappearing, and off the redshank goes again. There's lots of young birds around, lapwing, redshank, migrants are appearing, wagtails, etc. It's nice just to enjoy the silence sometimes. It's so rare, particularly here in the southeast. Sure, you can hear the distant hum, but by and large the sounds that dominate the landscape are redshank and lapwing. So I'm going to sign off here. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'll attempt to post a few pictures, although of course the film pictures aren't really anything to look at, they're just tests. But here from the marsh I might post one or two, see how they turn out. Very difficult to tell immediately, given how fast flying these birds are, whether or not they're going to be worthy of posting at all. But if there is, then I'll do so, and the link will, as always, be in the show notes. So until next time, take care and goodbye.